it started out, I got a degree in environmental science at Florida Keys Community College in 1976. And at that time, Keys were a really great place to live. So I spent a lot of time in that area doing environmental education, primarily reef ecology type things. Got a lot of boating experience. And when I finally decided to follow up with my degree at University of Florida, I had a lot of boating experience, and I got a job as an other personnel services, OPS, with the Fish and Wildlife Co-op unit there. And my initial assignment was to make sure grad students didn't hurt themselves and sink their boats and maintain the vessels. And the first research we were working on with the grad students was primarily fisheries, bass fisheries research on Orange Lackalusa lakes, and then down in Everglades at the Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge. And at that point, when I went back to school, at the co-op unit, I met Dr. Packard, Jane Packard, and she was working on a project to develop some more statistically significant methods of aerial survey. And my job initially was to input data on Sanibel captiva. We were working out of the Dig Darling Refuge. And then that evolved into the cooperative project with, at that time it was DNR, I believe, the Marine Lab out of St. Pete, FMRI. So we did aerial survey work, we did radar telemetry, we did necropsies on manatees that had a red tide outbreak at the time. And that sort of fell into the manatee aspects of that. As that project was winding down, the Aquatic Preserve Program was starting to hire. And because of my background with the manatees, with Dr. Packard, the position here in Crystal River, it sort of was kind of a natural fit. So I was hired to come up here and manage the St. Martin's Marsh Aquatic Preserve. And then as part of that program, we started doing land acquisition to preserve manatee habitat, which eventually became the Crystal River Preserve State Park. And so I spent roughly 17 years in service with the state through DNR and then eventually in the DEP, and did the habitat acquisition up here. And as part of that, I was on the Manatee Advisory Committee of Citrus County. So I met some of the other folks who were involved in the protective efforts at that point in time. And then through the years, it was more peripherally oriented toward manatees. It was really more habitat acquisition and management was the primary job. And then when I decided to retire from state service, decided to go back to my roots as a tour guide. And we opened up a Artworks Florida Kayak Company as initially strictly an eco-tour operation. And then that's sort of kind of blossomed into the retail as well.
Now you mentioned being on the Citrus County Manatee Advisory Board or Council or whatever it's called. I'm guessing that's the body that eventually codified guidelines for recovery of manatees in this county.
Right, that evolved into the MPP, the Manatee Protection Plan for Citrus County. Citrus County was the first county to adopt a Manatee Protection Plan.
And what time period would that have been?
That would have been early to mid-'80s.
Okay, so
and even into the 90s in some cases.
And as I'm sure you know, there were some counties were faster and some counties were much slower to do that. I think there were 13 designated counties that were considered critical habitat for manatees, and were charged with developing the manatee protection plans. And so you guys kind of came in first in that process. And of course, as many people know, Crystal River is a mecca for manatees, and many people come here to see them. And I guess that's part of what you do with your kayak tours. I mean, I imagine a large percentage of your clientele wants to see manatees. Or
yeah, especially in the winter months. Although manatees are here, at least some manatees are here year-round. It becomes much more difficult, obviously, to find them, and I think they're under quite a bit of pressure because primarily in the summertime you're going to find them on the feeding grounds, and that's really one of the areas where you don't really want to disturb them so much. So we sort of stay away from manatee tours in the warmer months, and we focus on just the winter months when they're in the thermal refuges. And we do a passive observation, a no-touch tour, and we've always done no-touch. As a biologist, and especially because part of my job in the Southwest Florida area involved day-to-day observations of manatees in the field, Charlotte Harbor and Estero Bay, those places. I have a feeling for how manatees behave in the wild, and there's clearly a difference in behavior between those animals in Southwest Florida and the animals in Northwest Florida.
can you give us a feeling?
It's really the approachability, and if you read through the literature, Crystal River has probably had more research done on the population here by grad students than any place else, and there's a number of the papers when commenting why they chose Crystal River is because of the ease of approachability of the manatees here. So there's clearly something going on where they've acclimated to humans. At least some of the animals have. makes them a little less of a wild animal, makes them a little bit easier to study, but then it also colors, I think, some of the things that they're seeing.
Now, you've had a lot of experience, as you mentioned, in this area, and you've seen a lot of different attitudes come and go and so forth. Can you give us kind of an overview for those that might not be familiar with this area and haven't been around here maybe? Can you give us a feeling for, how you've seen things change, both with regard to local attitudes and tourist interactions over, say, the last 20 years or so?
Well, it's been a long time coming, but there has clearly been an improvement, especially over these last 2 years, with the first emergency rule where the Fish and Wildlife Service established Kings Bay as a manatee refuge, and then implemented some very specific interaction rules there and enforced the rules. I think the enforcement needs to be emphasized. And then they made the rule permanent this year. So we've clearly seen a better behavior pattern from both the industry and from the people coming in. The aggressiveness has been toned down. In years past, it was really all about petting manatees, and it still is. But in the early days, it was perceived that if the Fish and Wildlife Service created sanctuaries, because pretty much every sanctuary that was ever put into Citrus County was fought by somebody in the industry or somebody who didn't want the government involved in our daily lives here. But it was a necessity because the tourism industry here has been growing since it started in, I'm probably guessing, the late 60s, early 70s is when they first started taking people to see manatees in this area. And of course, the manatee numbers have increased, as has the amount of people coming here. So, and of course, the development in the area as well. I came through Crystal River in 1972, and I don't think there was even a traffic light in Crystal River at that point in time. So as things have grown, there's been more overlap and more conflicts with the interaction for manatees. Citrus County and the Manatee Protection Plan, that Manatee Protection Plan does not deal with the tourism industry. That deals primarily with speed zones and development, marina siting and those kind of things. It doesn't really have anything to do with the industry itself, which left a gap. So when Fish and Wildlife Service came in and established a refuge and actually got their presence here, then they started to really influence how the interaction was occurring. And in the early years, there was some discussion about whether there should even be swim programs. And Pat Rose was at that time the Endangered Species Coordinator for the state of Florida, and he sort of went to bat for the industry here and developed some rules that we thought if people abided by those rules, that it would be an acceptable trade-off.
Okay.
And unfortunately, there was too many loopholes and too many lack of enforcement issues. And things kind of blossomed, and they got beyond the point where people were being rather aggressive with the manatees. And that necessitated the need for the sanctuaries. Manatees at some point in time were just constantly being bombarded. They would move away from one group and another group would pursue and pursue. So the sanctuaries were a compromise to give the manatees safe haven. Right. And that seems to have been fairly successful. It's very clear that when the manatees sanctuaries were established, they're marked by buoys, that, at least initially, looking at it, they looked at survey work and determined where the manatees, needed to be protected and put the buoys in. And that we did a pretty good guess on, hitting all the areas right. But then it became real apparent that it was not. Manatees are recognizing what the structure is, and they're clearly recognizing that that's a safe line, and they move behind it. They don't have to deal with the tourists or whoever. And they move outside if they do want to interact. And there's clearly some of them who have developed this affection, we could call it, I suppose, for humans. And it's not necessarily to their own good, but they're the ones who are initiating the contact. And that's where the area, in my mind, hasn't been addressed, and it's more of a long-term acclimation. We've dealt with the blatant harassment where somebody goes out and whacks a manatee in the head or something along those lines. Feeding is still an issue, mostly from the private sector, but I still find lettuce floating around out there occasionally, and that's maybe a matter of needing some better education and in some cases enforcement. There's a group of animals on the Chassahowitzka River that are being fed, and people are being told don't feed them, and they still do it anyway. So,
now you mentioned those manatees that are relatively few in number, but seem to have some sort of affinity for humans, and they will, of their own accord, apparently approach them. And I think what I heard you alluding to was that they may have learned that behavior over a long period of time and sort of have developed what would not, a behavior that wouldn't be seen in Southwest Florida.
Yeah,
Is
or
that
at least not with the frequency.
Right.
I think manatees are curious. That will come up with things to investigate, and then if you respond to them and you've conditioned them, whether it's through food, water, or touch, if they're very tactile animals, very clear that with their anatomy, with the hairs, and that I'll find it a stretch to think that they get some kind of pleasure or something out of being petted or touched. The question then becomes if that is an overriding drive, and there has been at least one research paper, I think it was King and Heinen, if I'm not mistaken, that commented on the manatee interactions, that they would rather interact with humans than be manatees at some point in time, at least some of these animals. And it's a behavior that I saw once or twice in the Fort Myers area, but you see much more frequently up here. So I think manatees may have this innate curiosity, and we've just reinforced that behavior by either touching or petting or feeding, because clearly feeding still goes on. And I think early on in the industry it probably was more prevalent than it is now. So we've acclimated these humans, and my observations are that the boat or the structure is a trigger. A boat will pull up, the manatee will immediately move toward the boat.
They've learned something.
They've learned that something is going to happen.
Right.
And in the case of the group in Chassahowitzka, it's very clear that they're looking not as much for the touches, but for being fed, because their approach to the boat is atypical from what you see in Crystal River. In Crystal River, you typically see manatees approach from the stern. They'll swim around, they'll look at the boat, they'll come around from behind it. In Chassahowitzka, these animals are coming up directly to the side of the boat and sticking their heads up and kind of looking around. And that leads me to believe that that conditioning was feeding in that particular case more so than what you're seeing up here.
Now, you mentioned that your tours on kayak involve a no-touch. Obviously, you're above the water, and I guess even if a manatee comes up to the surface, you still have a no-touch policy. And can you comment on, for those people that might feel like that's really taking some part of the experience away, can you comment on, why you feel that's still a very meaningful experience in terms of a person coming out to see and interact with manatees?
Well, as part of the tours we do are eco-tours, and part of eco-tours is education. And if we take the time to explain to people why we have that policy, and that the number one fact that people have to keep in mind is that manatees are not here to entertain us. Manatees are here because they're trying to survive. And if somebody could legitimately explain to me what benefit touching a manatee has for the manatee, then I would consider changing. But there really is nothing that positively impacts a manatee by having a human touch them. Well, I've always been attracted to the outdoors, and obviously working with manatees in the field and doing eco-tours keeps you in the outdoors. And I've always kind of strived to make it a better experience for not only my customers, but the manatees itself. That's why we've kind of promoted the no touch, and we've held firm to that. I could run bigger groups, I could do different kind of tours, but I don't find it necessary. Over the 10 years we've been doing no touch tours, I've lost a couple of customers, I'm sure, that that never booked with us because they knew what our policy is. So we make that very clear up front. We don't guarantee sightings because they're wild animals, and we actually try to go out of our way to avoid the situations where we have a lot of interaction going on with swimmers, and look at manatees in a more natural setting, which is a little bit tough in Kings Bay because it's an urbanized or suburbanized settings, but that's what we strive for. And then through the entire work, and being persistent with the no touch and making it an issue. Some people don't like to hear it as an issue, but I think it is. I think we've influenced the overall behavior. I think we've moved it, we're not as far as we need to go, but I think we've moved it in the right direction. And I think the aggressive nature of some of the interactions has really been toned down considerably.
That's great. In terms of, the trajectory of your own career and how, I'd like you to tell us about some of the challenges that maybe you didn't see coming or wouldn't have anticipated that you've had to deal with, both in terms of, developing the manatee protection plan and these kinds of issues related to habitat acquisition, habitat use, correct behavior of people, whatever you choose to focus on. What are the challenges that you've had to sort of confront and work through?
Well, I think, in the early part of my career as a manager, I was developing management plans and implementing policies, that kind of stuff, that previous background was pretty much field research, and there was very little political science involved in that. And that's the one thing that really shocked me early on, as right out of college, is, well, the biology says this, so this is what we should do, not taking into account the politics of the situation. And I was blindsided a couple of times by the stuff that seemed to me to be, a no-brainer. And all of a sudden, it became a huge issue.
Right.
And so that was one of the things. Later on, when actually looking at the manatee interaction aspects of it, which the Aquatic Reserve Program really has nothing to do with that part. That was sort of a peripheral thing, and then eventually into the ecotours, that the prohibitions that we have on interaction with manatees that were actually needed, because why would somebody actually do that?
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, the reality is that people do that. That's why you end up with laws.
Right. What keeps you motivated to keep pursuing what you know to be the right course of action when there's so many powerful forces, a lot of times, particularly in this area, aligned against you?
It's a matter of your principles and your ethics. I mean, I believe in how we do things, and I believe back to the science again, there's a scientific basis behind it. And some people, simply don't know the science. Other people don't want to know the science. And so you just, promote the education and, the understanding as much as you can. Ultimately, it comes down to, your personal values. And they'll be honest, there's economics involved in it.
Mm-hmm.
You have to consider what the economic risks are, and if you're willing to take those risks. For my wife and I, we're confident in what we do, and that our market and marketing is true ecotourism.
Right.
And true ecotourism, would not accept 90% of what goes on out there. So
Right.
that's really more toward the passive observation. That's what all the agencies preach, is passive observation. And in Crystal River, what it comes down to is really, what are they willing to enforce? Fish and Wildlife Service, and they've clearly made a push these last couple of years, within the industry, to promote passive observation. They've actually required it as part of your special use permit for the refuge, you're required to promote passive observation. But when it actually comes down to the enforcement of such, there's really, it's a tough one to enforce. And there are some issues, with how they do that.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your role as a person that promotes ecotourism, it sounds like part of that is kind of a pretty grand vision of respect for other creatures in their natural habitat. That's what I'm picking up from
Yeah,
you,
well, when you look at ecotourism, and you look at, you have to start with, all right, the experts in the field, researchers, scientists, and make recommendations through the agencies that are charged with protecting these animals. And in our case, it's Fish and Wildlife Service. It's actually the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, because of the Manatee Sanctuary Act. And then you also have the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So that puts NOAA, National Marine Fisheries Service, in the mix as well. And then you look at all the guidelines that have been developed for dolphin and whale watching, and it's essentially the same thing. Every single one of those is more strict than what is allowed to occur here at Crystal River. So at the very least, whether you're actually in the water or not, you should at least have those guidelines in the back of your mind.
Right.
And because you have animals that solicit contact, that makes some gray areas. But at some point in time, those gray areas have got to be better defined.
Okay. So if I'm thinking about this, and I don't know anything about Crystal River, but I'm a biologist coming in from a different part of the world, let's say, and I said to you, wow, Matt, it looks like to me that the whole area here should be made a sanctuary. That would solve a lot of problems. How can you give people that aren't familiar with the area a feeling for why that would be a difficult thing to promote?
Well, part of it is the overall makeup and what manatees are using for their warm water habitats in this area. It's not a power plant where you have a security zone. It's in people's backyards. And so you have navigational issues, you have property rights issues, and there are only certain things that legally can be done, and then there are a lesser amount of things that practically can be done. And Citrus County has had a history of every time that there's an effort to better protect manatees, somebody will fight it. This last one with the local group here that's fighting it. Pursue your dream. I mean, if working with marine mammals is what you want to do, pursue that. Take the time to learn about what happens. Think about long term. What do you envision long term? Make the contacts with people who are already in the field. There's a good resource online, or several really good resources online, which is significantly different from when I started. Back then, the internet was not a big thing. That's hard to believe, but that's kind of scary at that point. But that's the reality is, you make the contacts with people. With social networking today, that's something to definitely to take advantage of, and you can make some initial contacts. I know that one of my counterparts here, when he came into the area, had already made contacts in the area through Facebook, and which was actually very beneficial to us who wanted the protection measures in place, because that's who we made the contacts with. So he already had an idea when he came into the area, and it's the same thing. Know what you're getting into, and the social networking can really benefit you there. Do volunteer work, take internships. Anything you can do to get your foot in the door, because what it ultimately will come down to is it's not necessarily how much you know, it's how much you know and who you know. Add both of those together, and that's the real that's the real part of it.